All right, thank you so much for being with us tonight. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Yeah, thank you. We are always very honored to be here in the space of the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American culture and history. The Auburn Avenue Research Library is one of our favorite partners. We do so many events here. We're very grateful to the staff and volunteers who make this historic place welcoming to so many artists, writers, activists from all over the country, but especially folks here in Georgia. So if you've not had a chance to check out the archive, definitely come on another day when you can explore it. It's a really amazing resource that we have in our city. So thank you to AARL. We are really, really excited to get to be celebrating Danzy Senna's brand new book. Danzy hit the scene with Caucasia many years ago now, although I still remember fresh off the presses, so it doesn't feel like that long ago to me, and has now become the author of 4 works of fiction, including, of course, the best-selling Caucasia. Her most recent novel is New People. She has also written a memoir. She is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, and she teaches writing at the University of Southern California. This new book that we are celebrating here tonight is called Color Television, and she's here with us as just the second stop on her tour. So let's warm it up for her, help her get off to a great start. She's here in conversation with Tayari Jones, who's one of our all-time favorite novelists. Tayari is the author of 4 novels, most recently An American Marriage, which was published in 2018, was an Oprah Book Club selection, and appeared on Barack Obama's summer reading list. It was awarded the Women's Prize for Fiction, the Aspen Words Prize, and an NAACP Image Award. It has been published in 24 countries. Tayari has also written one of my favorite books, Silver Sparrow, Leaving Atlanta, and so many more amazing things. Tayari's a master craftsperson, a generous writer, and amazing interlocutor. So please put your hands together for Tayari Jones and Danzy Senna.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Danzy, and welcome to Atlanta.
Thank you. I love being here with you.
And congratulations on this book. And you are now like the queen of all media. Congratulations on the Good Morning America Book Club. Congratulations on the profile in the New Yorker. Congratulations on the rave in the Washington Post. And mostly congratulations for being in this world of writing for 3 decades.
I've been here a long time. We were talking about that, how we've now got readers who don't know our first books because they weren't alive. At least I do.
I was actually going to ask Danzy to just kind of walk us through her career, because Caucasia was published in 1998. So they're like fully adult people that weren't born yet.
Yeah.
And I feel like with this new book getting so much attention, you're going to have people who kind of are going to parachute into, you know, the world of your readers and not necessarily know your route. So if someone were to sit next to you on a plane, which is going to happen a lot because she's on a major tour, and they say, so what do you write about? What would you say?
Well, of course, Jane gets asked that in the novel, and she says mulattoes. But I feel like I write about America, and I was an American Studies major in college, and that sounds really general, but I was interested in the sort of world of people who are crossing boundaries and mixing, and that is the geography that I kind of came of age in when I was born in 1970, and my parents were an interracial couple, the first generation that were married after the Supreme Court knocked down the anti-miscegenation laws. And so a lot of my work flows out of my interest in American history and Black American history, interracial American history, and going to the sort of intimate stories of people who live in this neither nor world, or this and also world.
Can I tell you, I was born in 1970. And I always think that who I am is shaped by the fact that I was born in 1970 like my parents gave me and my brothers Swahili names. It was like it was like the 70s was a whole thing. I felt like it was Black people trying to figure out who we were going to be going forward.
It's such an interesting moment. I didn't know we were born the same year.
When's your birthday?
September 13th.
Virgo. I'm Sagittarius. You were slightly older than me, but but the 70s.
But yes, no. See, this is cool. The thing about this is I have gone through so many incarnations of mixed race identity that have changed profoundly in my lifetime.
Tell me more.
Because when I was born, you were Black. If you had a Black parent. If you had a white parent and a Black parent, you were decidedly a Black person. And that was not a question mark, no matter how you looked, how you presented. And that was the identity that I grew up with. In my family, and all three siblings identified as Black. We were sent to, my parents divorced, but we were sent to an Afrocentric school.
Me too.
You too?
Yes.
Oh my God, we're so bonded. I talk a lot in this book about how the only indisputable identity I have is that I'm Gen X, and that I'm so firmly someone who was born, or this character is also someone who was so firmly born in a certain era and formed out of that era. And so my parents were very politicized, very radical in their thinking, and very much influenced. My father was very much in the throes of the Black Power movement, Black Pride movement. And so I kind of emerged out of that. And then in my lifetime, then I move into the 80s and 90s, and there are more and more people like me, and they're asking for their own category. And that was a shift in the culture when people wanted to check more than one box. They wanted to identify as more than one thing. And I started to feel like a relic of another time. And I think we're in the third era now, I've decided, of real sort of fracturing and questions about what is the relationship between people of mixed Black and other, people who are Black and also something else, and the Black community. There's a conversation around Kamala and people who are immigrants, and that's a whole conversation that's new. I think that's just, what interests me is how these conversations are not ones that were going on when I was growing up. And we were talking about this, like you were talking about growing up with people who you assumed to be Black, and they were just people who had been sort of.
Well, in the South, we have a big tent Blackness, right? Like when I look at in the South, when I was growing up, there were white people, and we didn't even really know the white people, but we knew they were there somewhere. We just didn't know them. I went to Mays High School, where we had exactly one white student who was a child prodigy who was graduating in high school at 11. And his parents, for some reason, decided to drive him way across town to go to our all-Black high school, their 11-year-old child prodigy. But we thought that anybody that wasn't a white person was a Black person.
Right.
Wherever they were from.
Yeah. Yeah,
and they did not dispute this either.
Same era that I was in. Yeah. And there was a lot of Pan-Africanism and a real interest in the sort of global identity of Blackness as well in the 70s, right? So
it was a different time. But where did you grew up in Boston? In Boston.
Yeah. And the desegregation sort of, my sister and I were bused to white schools. And, I was identified as a Black person being bused. And that was a very violent time, a very crazy time. And it also left, the racism was so pernicious and acute and overt that there was no kind of room for ambiguity. You didn't want to identify as anything but Black at that moment. So it was, it's like a history that I think is not fully understood or remembered in some ways, that was the moment, by people who are born later, the intensity of that time around identity is something that I kind of feel like I was formed out of that moment, and all of my work flows out of that.
I feel like the way that you talk about it, there's a certain kind of gravity and intensity to it, but your books are so funny though.
Yeah, this is, I would say, my most comic novel, and it sounds like I'm not writing comedy at all, what I was just talking about.
But it is very funny. It is funny. Why don't you read us some of this?
Okay, so this is a novel about a woman who's a writer who's living in Los Angeles, and she has been working on a novel. Her husband is a kind of grouchy artist. They have 2 children, and they are struggling financially. And a lot of this book is about money and financial insecurity. But I think I'm going to read from a theme from when they first meet in Brooklyn in a different era and a different space than they're living now. And this is sort of their origin story. And I'll just set it up a little. I'm just going to read a little bit of the first page and then jump to the scene where they actually start to talk. Jane first met Lenny at a house party in Brooklyn. He'd come on the arm of another woman. Jane had come alone. She'd been just emerging from a bad breakup, the latest in a string of them. She was not usually the sort of woman to go after another woman's man, and she might not have done so had it not been for the psychic. Not that she believed in psychics, not now, not then, but the first session had been an early birthday gift from her sister, who had a long relationship with the occult. Jane found the psychic's soothing voice over the phone comforting. His name was Wesley Brown. On his website, he had not actually used the word psychic. Instead, he called himself an intuitive psychodynamic counselor with a specialty in racial alchemy. In their first session, he told Jane that her future husband was on his way, nearly there. The way he said it, with a kind of bemused certainty, made Jane understand why her sister liked him so much. He was more fun than a therapist. Across the room at the party, a black man was standing at the chip table alone, shoveling corn chips with salsa into his mouth. He was wearing Vans sneakers and a t-shirt that said "part of the problem." What was it that the psychic had predicted? He'd said Jane was about to meet a black man who was funny, a black man who would be wearing West Coast shoes. The Vans were definitely West Coast, and the t-shirt was funny, pretty funny. She sidled over, drink in hand. "Do you live around here?" "Brooklyn? No, I hate Brooklyn. People here are pigs." She asked him where he lived instead. "Nowhere, really." He wiped the chip grease off his mouth with a cocktail napkin. "I'm staying in LA for now. I hate it there too. Different breed of pigs." So jumping ahead to them continuing this conversation. That night of the party in Brooklyn, Jane wanted to expel her mother's voice, her sister's voice, even the psychic's voice from her head. She wanted to be just Jane for once, Jane at a party letting her life unfold. But they were all there, a coven of witches, whispering to her as she stood across from this black man and his white girlfriend she'd learned over the last 15 minutes was an eco-poet named Lilith. Jane reminded herself that Lenny was just some random guy she was standing across from, a random guy who was in a relationship. But then Lilith said she was going to get a drink, and Lenny called out to her to get him a whiskey on the rocks. The words had a funny echo, and Jane remembered something else the psychic had said. He described the guy she was going to meet as tall, dark, handsome, funny, wearing West Coast shoes on the rocks. "Random question," Jane said to him now. "Have you ever seen a psychic?" She wasn't sure where she was going with it. She just needed to keep him looking at her. But he was looking at the snack table, searching for something. "I don't believe in that shit," he said. "I do." It was Lilith, back with his drink. She handed it to him, then linked her arm in his. "I guess what I mean is, I used to believe in them," Lilith said. "I used to go to psychics all the time, palm readers, tarot card readers, Reiki, energy healers, you name it." She gave Jane a wincing smile full of pity. The thing is, she said, people only go to psychics when they're single. Have you noticed that? She laughed and kissed Lenny. He kissed her back stiffly. She thought she caught a glimpse of trappedness in his eyes. Jane wasn't letting up. She forged on with aggressive small talk. What do you do for a living? She asked him. I'm a painter. And you? I'm a writer, a fiction writer. Lilith was still stroking him, pouting a little, trying to get him to look at her. But he kept his eyes on Jane. What world do you write about? Jane liked his question. What world? He was clearly someone who understood how this worked. Mulattoes, she said. I write about mulattoes. Isn't that an offensive term? Lilith said. Lenny smirked at Jane. I've always liked it. Better than biracial, right? Definitely better, Jane said, feeling a real flicker between them now. Biracial could be any old thing. Korean and Panamanian, Chinese and Egyptian, but a mulatto is always specifically a mulatto. Lenny nodded, eyed her. That's for sure. Lilith was watching Jane now with interest, taking in her features one by one. If we had a baby, she said to Lenny, would she look like her? Sorry, what's your name again? Jane. Would it look like Jane? Jane was almost impressed by the subtle way the woman had neutered her, reducing her to a baby, and at the same time, in the same sentence, had conjured up her own interracial sex life and future family with Lenny. Lenny didn't answer, just gave Jane an awkward, maybe apologetic look. Lilith whispered something in Lenny's ear then, and it was as if Jane disappeared. He smiled and nodded, and Lilith started kissing him slowly on the neck. Lenny tried to wiggle out of Lilith's grasp, but she pulled his face toward her. Then he submitted, and they were kissing for real, tongues and all, and Jane was standing there before them, her face burning. If you'll excuse me, she said to nobody, and wandered off. In the kitchen, she fixed herself a large, icy glass of rum and coke. Then she stood in the doorway, trying not to watch them, but watching them. Lilith was the lover, and Lenny was the beloved. She could see it in the way she tilted into him, eyes fixed on his face, and in the way he leaned back slightly, his tense smile. Now Lilith was stroking Lenny's face, saying something that made him shake his head no, laughing. Jane took another gulp of her drink, bilious thoughts crowding her brain. What did he see in her? Lilith was so thin, so frail, with pale, almost translucent skin and a giant mane of blonde hair. Was he a necromantic? Did he have a thing for cadavers? Why would an educated, sane Black man choose to be with a woman like that in this century? Did he not realize that once he married white, he would never get to talk unremitting shit about white people again? He'd always have to worry about hurting Lilith's feelings. And he couldn't bring her out in public with his friends, could he? Unless all his friends were white, which she doubted. He wasn't giving off miscellaneous vibes. Though, what did she really know about Lenny? He was a stranger, someone she'd just met. And she reminded herself Wesley Brown was just a charlatan with a fancy website. Maybe this couple she was watching tongue wrestle across the room were actually a good match. Jane tried to think generous, post-racial thoughts. Maybe Liz was funny. Maybe Lenny loved her for her kindness. Jane could already tell that she was not kind. Jane came from a union like the one that Lilith and Lenny were about to embark on. Ebony and ivory together in disharmony. And yet, perhaps because it was her origin story, she could not bear the sight of interracial love. Well, she could, but not when the man was Black and the woman was white. Of course, she didn't express this opinion often, and not in mixed company. She knew it wasn't a good look. When you hated the same thing Strom Thurmond did, albeit for different reasons, you knew you were in problematic territory. She took comfort in the fact that it wasn't like womanhood she was trying to protect. It was Black manhood she wanted to save from the clutches of white womanhood. That was different, right? Why the long face? It was Stu, their host. Stu shared an office with Jane at the college up in the Bronx where they were adjuncts. He was one of those goofy, oversized white guys who somehow cobbled his middling novels into a career. That mediocre white guy they kept hiring year after year out of nostalgia. Stu was self-deprecating in the extreme. He knew he was living on borrowed time. He understood his own obsolescence, and that made him bearable, even lovable. The party tonight was to celebrate Stu's engagement to Priya, an Indian social science professor who was writing a book about the caste system. Do you believe in psychics, Jane asked Stu. Hell no. He threw an arm around her. Okay, so listen, Priya has a cousin here tonight. He thinks you're cute. Will you let me play matchmaker? He pointed to a guy standing in a circle of other guests. The guy was smiling shyly at Jane. He wasn't bad, not bad at all. Jane looked back at Lenny, who had Lilith's tongue in his mouth again. That's okay, she said. I'm sort of involved with someone else already. Somewhere between the chip table and the kitchen, she realized she had fully committed to the psychic story. Damn, Stu said, I was hoping we could be cousins or whatever it is we'd be if you married BJ. Siblings? I'm touched. She looked at him with a welling of drunken affection. Stu, you're the last white man I can stand to be around. Have I ever told you that? Thanks, Jane. She looked again toward Lenny and Lilith. What is it with those two? They're really going at it, Stu said. That's the guy Lilith has been telling me about. You know Lilith, right, from the mom? Jane glanced at Stu. Sure, I know her. I thought old Lilith would never settle down. She rolled an ice cube around in her mouth. From everything Priya says, Stu said, she's bonkers for him. She's planning to move to the West Coast to be with him. Can you imagine Lilith with her Victorian skin walking around in the Los Angeles sun baking? He laughed a little. Priya says Lilith is suddenly obsessed with having a baby with him. Lilith, a baby. Are you processing that? I'm trying, she said. I guess it makes sense. I mean, their kids would be cute, right? Like you. They might be monstrous, Jane said. No, and seriously, nobody wants to have white babies anymore, Stu said. Not even me, and I used to be one. Come on, why not? White babies can be cute. But not like the babies I'm going to make with Priya. They're going to be fucking insane.
So in the novel, she obviously takes that woman's man, marries him, has 2 children, and now they're both trying to be artists. She's trying to write a novel that her husband describes as the mulatto War and Peace. And he is a painter, and he doesn't want to include any images, any racially identifying images in his painting. They are broke, and they are living in the house of a rich friend of hers. They're house sitting for a year.
Like a friend of me.
Yes, but they're living up in this man's house. They are drinking all the liquor. Yes, they're drinking up all his wine cellar. And they're trying to figure out how to make a go of it as artists. So much of this book is really about the ways that people try to support their art.
Yeah, and especially, they've chosen to live in Los Angeles. It's one of the most expensive cities. And her husband does these paintings, as he said, that are just figurative. And as a Black artist, he keeps being told that, if he puts something identifiable, a figure, a Black figure in his art, it will sell better. But he refuses to. And she's sort of the opposite extreme in that she sort of writes obsessively about race and about the specific demographic. And
how many pages is the book?
And the book is extremely, it's 100,000 words. It goes back to Sally Hemings, leads up to Zoe Kravitz. It's like every biracial person
Except Obama.
Except Obama is in this book. And it's just, kind of, I was interested in all of the ways that we as writers of color sort of hit this wall of the gatekeepers. And no matter what you do or which way you go, it feels sometimes like a trap, and like you're sort of not fitting into their idea of what you should create. And the husband is going in one direction and she's going in the other, and both of them are broke. as a result.
They're absolutely broke. They're living in these people's house. I couldn't get over them drinking up all the wine. They're drinking up all these people's liquor.
Old, highly expensive bottles of wine. Yeah.
And it's also a novel about the place of the novel, right? Because she goes to write for television. That's where the title colored television comes from.
Yeah. Yeah, she sort of decides that prestige television is the novel of our times. And she teaches as an adjunct in college, and she's noticing that even the English professors, people who have devoted their lives to studying literature, all they want to talk about in the coffee break is about what did they watch on TV last night.
So is the novel dead? Is the novel over?
Well, when I began this novel, it was the height of prestige television, and it was right before the pandemic that I began this. And I did have that thought that like these shows like Succession and Insecure and White Lotus had really taken over the conversation, and this is what people were. This was the mirror being held up to the culture in the way that novels used to, and I did start to wonder about me just being so devoted to the page, and I dabbled a bit in television, but I think it's changed a lot in the 5 years since I started this book, and television has kind of crashed, and I feel that there's an opening for novels. People kind of overdosed on television
During the pandemic.
and I feel, and I'm just, this is all optimism, this is me hoping this into existence, but I do feel that people are kind of relieved to go back to reading again, and there's a kind of hunger for other forms of entertainment that don't involve screens, because we all have been so saturated in these mediums.
I will say the parts of the book where she I hope this isn't giving to say she starts writing for TV. I already said it. I'm like, can I say this? But she goes to write for television, and she's trying to write. I felt like it was like she's trying to write Blackish, but it's like biracial, like
yeah, you could say that.
And so she's cheating, like it feels almost like she's cheating on the novel.
Yeah, she's cheating on the novel with television, and I was interested in, putting this desperate novelist who's really kind of demoralized by the literary world into this really manic world of television. Because when I dabbled in it, I would go to these meetings and everything seemed about to happen until it didn't. I mean, the level of kind of hyperbole and excitement, and like everybody was on Adderall and they were all just so excited about everything that came out of my mouth. And then I would just like never hear from them again. And I thought it was just like the difference between the solitude and the level of sort of slow cooker novel writing that you're in isolation, and then this sort of insane atmosphere of television, and the feeling you can get that you could leap into a whole different class bracket overnight. And that's really, pervasive in Los Angeles, where sort of like every Uber driver is 2 auditions away from becoming Brad Pitt. And, your Starbucks barista has a script they're working on, and everybody has a sense of, potential life-changing event any day now. Their ship's going to come in. And I thought, putting this particular character in that situation would lead to some interesting situations for her.
I mean, there are lots of interesting situations, and even like the Kardashians cameo here.
Yeah, the
like all of them.
The producer who's making this show with her is obsessed with the fact that mixed race people are the fastest growing demographic in the United States, and he's interested in it purely at a capitalist, sales level. Like, if we make this show, imagine the audience. And he goes to a Kardashian toddler party and realizes that there's just like an army of biracial children that these women have spawned. And he smokes some weed and sort of goes down a really, sort of just dark and disturbing path, thinking about how many biracial people there are, and the sort of erasure of blackness that involves, that Black people are going to get washed out of existence by this Kardashian kind of nightmare. It goes pretty weird there. Yeah.
It was weird, but it was also kind of funny. And it was also strange the way he is so casually offensive to her. Like he calls her a mixed nut.
Yeah.
And he just says it so casually, oh, you mixed nuts or like this or like that. I was surprised at the kind of casual cruelty of it.
Yeah, I mean that's Hollywood, and especially in the comedy sort of sitcom world, there's like a sort of aggressive humor that everybody's trying to get their line in the show, and it creates this sort of everybody's trying to one up each other, and even around race and humor. I mean, I was in these spaces where that was the culture. So people keep calling this book satire, and I'm like, no, this is realism. This is exactly what it's like as I saw it.
I feel like everything that's a little bit funny, people call it satire these days.
Yeah.
And I don't know if they think it's satire or if they don't know what the word means. Because that's a real possibility also.
Yeah, or they think this is just so exaggerated. I mean, maybe they just don't believe that is the world.
I can see that. I do think that your character has access to worlds that someone else may not have access to. And in coming back, reporting this insanity, there's a sense of it can't be possibly true.
Yeah.
But I feel like you write with such authority that I believe that. Like I haven't been in those worlds. Like, I'm from Atlanta. I still live in Atlanta. And so it's a world I knew nothing about, but I felt like I was in such good hands with you as a writer that I believe that people in California are insane.
You're right.
Well, I think we should. Yes. Yes. See, look, ER is like, yep. We should take some questions about this book, about this wonderful moment that Danzy's having, about the other books, about what you're reading, about what you're writing next. I have more questions, but
That's right.
There we go. I had the pleasure of hearing your Fresh Air interview this week. And you were singing the praises of queer writers of color, but you didn't get to name any of them. And I would love to know who you're reading along those lines, and what are you reading? And more importantly, Jorge said it's not reading but rereading that matters. Are you rereading in that?
Yeah. I am reading a book called Blackouts by Justin Torres, who it won the National Book Award. And it's a really beautiful and strange novel about illness and queer history. And then I just read a memoir by Carvel Wallace called Another Word for Love, which is really beautiful about masculinity and his childhood and his mother, and it's like a very traumatic childhood, but it's told with such love, and I love that complexity. And I actually picked up Faulkner recently, because I haven't read Faulkner since I was in college when I did my undergraduate thesis on Light in August, and it's I was reading it to sort of go back to the sort of original source material that started my interest in the figure of the tragic mulatto in literature. And that was one of the three books I studied. I studied Nella Larson's Passing, James Weldon Johnson's autobiography of an ex-colored man, and this Faulkner book, and looked at this figure who passes for white or crosses the color line, and what that figure says about race in America as a kind of Rorschach test. So I went back to look at the original book that I hadn't looked at since college, and it was very beautiful, very dense, and extremely racist. Extremely racist.
Someone said that Black writers who write about characters who pass write about what led them to pass. And once they start passing for the Black writer, that's the end of the story. Like that's the end of, and then white writers write about what happened once they passed.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, that difference. I've noticed that it's often Black writers write about what is lost in the act of passing, what is, given away of value. And then white writers historically have written about what is gained by passing. And they don't see anything that involves mourning or grief. And
they write it like it's an escape.
Yes, exactly.
Like it's a jailbreak. Yeah.
So the sort of death, and that word passing, also means death. That idea, I think, is baked into some of those Black depictions of passing, which is interesting, that difference.
Here's a question for you. In our new, like you said, a new racial reality, is it possible to pass, or is one just what one is?
Yeah. No, I thought that too. That there are all these writers now who say, I'm not one thing or another, I'm just human, or I'm post-racial, or I don't believe in race. And I think that it isn't possible to pass anymore. I don't think anyone cares if you are mixed race and you're, you can sort of float between the two things when it's convenient, but it may be a different kind of passing. I mean, I think there are other ways to pass that don't involve denying your 23andMe result.
Now, I did read, and was it in the New Yorker, they were talking about your 23andMe?
Yeah.
Okay, I have not done 23andMe.
I wish I hadn't, because now I can't get away with a crime. Apparently, they have my.
That's why I'm afraid of 23andMe. Because the law enforcement works with that database. So let's say one of your first cousins goes up in the 23andMe, because I have a first cousin, he wants somebody to tell him he's a Zulu. He is not a Zulu. Because he does 23andMe. So now, like, let's say I commit a crime, justifiably for something, but I commit a crime. And I get away with it because I'm a smart person. I've committed a perfect crime, except for my cousin who went to 23andMe, and now they can figure out that it's one of his first cousins. And they would narrow it down to me. Yes, because I'm just thinking, like, I'm going to go to jail.
No, I'm going to go to jail.
His biology is destiny.
No, I talk about this in this book that
And you're like 27%?
Yes, 27.
What?
African.
Because you're not.
Yes,
I know, but that's a good question, right? What are we talking?
no, that's trial. That's the only one I ever want to know about.
But the producer in this asks her percentage and says, I know you mixed people like to spit into vials. And it's, it's like, what mixed person has ever resisted the allure of the 23andMe? And she talks about that her curiosity got the best of her, and now she'll never get away with murder.
Now, how many of y'all have 23andMe? 23rd and y'all? How many people got a racial breakdown?
Yeah.
I didn't do it for the same reason.
Well, no, everyone's
And I don't want any secret relatives either. Like,
I had to cut off that because I was getting new relatives every day. Yeah,
I actually shared my ancestry on Facebook like 4 or 5 years ago, and I was like only 38% African. And it was this big thing where they were like, of course you are. You have more white in you. Why wouldn't you? And for me, I was upset because I didn't have more Black heritage. Like it was something for me, but everybody else just, as they always do, make jokes about you being, either more white or those types of things. So
yeah, I mean, I think
38 is a lot, but you got more than her.
No, the guy who was interviewing me had the exact same number, which was wild. We like compared our screens.
But do we really even know? Like, you send this off and they send you a letter with some numbers. But do we know?
But it's also like it turns race back into science and into something that is disconnected from history and economics and memory and kinship and experience. And I feel like, you know, that is where race is born for me, is not in these numbers, but in what moment of history you were born in, what's politics, the law, the, you know, all of these things that form our identity are so much more complicated than this 23andMe.
I would agree with that. And I know that I'm uncomfortable with fracturing Blackness. As I grew up in a unified Blackness. Like I said, I grew up where people who weren't even Black, we thought they were Black and we made them Black. So I'm used to kind of an all-encompassing Blackness and not a comparative Blackness.
Yeah.
And so it kind of weirds me out, this idea of some company telling me how Black I am or am not.
Right. Yeah, no, my husband did, you know, all of his family has been Black for ever, as far as he knows. Just and his came out 40% British. And that's just, you know, what it is to be Black in America. If you are the descendant of the slave trade, we have to be real about what that was about and what happened to people in those, you know, in that history. So it's not, to me, that's quintessentially Black to have been mixed from the beginning. To me, that's part of our story, and that is Blackness in America. So I don't feel that's a contradiction. Those numbers don't contradict the story of the American Black experience to me.
I would definitely agree with that. It just, this idea of someone having a higher quantity than someone else, and I don't know, I don't like it. I guess I'm a Black romantic. I'm a romantic Black person, and that I like to think that we're family in a way that parsing these details seems kind of counter to this kind of idea of, like I said, a unified Blackness. And I know that's sentimental and maybe even nostalgic.
Mm-hmm.
But
for Black people, that wouldn't matter. This is my cousin, my sister. We're not even, you know, you already can when you know there's no blood relationship. If your mother's best friend has some kids, those are your cousins. Doesn't matter what percentage of West African they are. You know what I mean?
yes, we do. I completely agree with that. But okay, enough of me talking. Anybody else have any questions?
But talk to the mic so we can get on.
Oh,
Jack.
they're worried about the live stream.
It's just a
On the live stream.
Hey, I met her outside. I was like, that's Danzy. But I have a question, and I don't mean to, I guess, bring up Percival Everett. However, there's a part in the first chapter or two where you are discussing Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. You discussed Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and I immediately thought of your husband's book, I Am Not Sidney Poitier. And what I wanted, and the interesting thing she says about Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is that nobody knows what happens after the dinner is over, and the families have to be who they are. Like how does that actually work? But I wanted to ask, is there any time that you and your husband's work kind of speak like to each other, or do you ever remember something he wrote and you will kind of use that? Because immediately I thought of I Am Not Sidney Poitier when you brought up that movie.
That's interesting. I'm sure there's some that these, you know, he was watching those movies obsessively when he was writing that novel, and so that maybe kind of entered my subconscious. But at the same time, you know, we have been together for a long time, and but when we met, we were both had published books and we had been writing for a long time, and our obsessions were already in place in some ways. So those were things we connected on that were already shared interests. So who knows? But it's possible that those movies playing a lot in our household were in my consciousness. Yeah. But that's kind of an iconic interracial early depiction of an interracial couple. So
and we've had two different versions, like maybe two or three. TV versions.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for this. I'm enjoying it. My question is around the characters, I mean, the main character writing this screenplay. What television programs do you think about that portray the mulatto? What movies, TV, whatever?
I've been thinking about this recently, and I think it's sort of shocking how there is nothing. I think that there's a lot of representation of mixed race people, you know, in film and television. It's this look that they seem to constantly cast in, especially women, in Target commercials and everywhere, you know, the female role. There's all these women who are playing Black women, but maybe a biracial background. But that story of being mixed, I have never really seen portrayed well, and including Mixed Dish, which I thought was horrific and idiotic. But I haven't, and I've studied this and looked back at like the earliest depictions in my lifetime of mixed race characters. And I was thinking of the Jeffersons and the couple upstairs who have, do you remember this?
On the Jeffersons, Lenny Kravitz mama.
Yeah, Roxy Roker, and she was married to a white guy, and they had a daughter.
Wait, Jenny, yes, Jenny.
Jenny.
Lionel and Jenny.
Right. Who was played by someone who did not have a white parent. The daughter was not mixed.
Right, she looked just like her mama.
Yes. And then they had a couple of episodes where they had this son that came back, Alan.
Yes.
These lost episodes, have you seen these? And he is played by a white guy.
Like an actual white person?
Yes. And he was passing in Europe as white. And he was back, and it's like, yes, this is this crazy, like, lost history of tragic mulattoes played for laughs. And he comes back, and Jenny's angry at him for passing as white, and he and George Jefferson get into the dozens, and he calls him out. He uses all sorts of like racial epithets. It's crazy.
Who uses the racial epithet?
Both of them.
They epithet each other.
Yes. You got to see these two episodes.
Is it on YouTube?
Yes.
Oh,
You gotta watch it. It's crazy. But it's almost better than some of the more like sentimental, cloying modern day representations of mixed.
So was he older or younger than Jenny?
I don't remember, but his name's Alan, and he's played by a white guy, and she plays a Black woman, and it shows that kind of awkwardness where they don't know how to portray even visually the child of these two people. It's like so far outside of the American imagination at that moment in the 70s. Which is recent, but it's still, I think we still have a long way to go in terms of representation.
I have homework, so
Yeah, you gotta watch it.
I'm just wondering about your writing process in general. But there are some surprising decisions made specifically in other television, but in general in this fiction writing. I'm wondering if you sit down and know all of these sort of unexpected things that your characters are going to do, or do you ever have moments where the characters sort of surprise you and kind of take over and get into something that's different than you maybe were writing?
Yeah, part of the reason it takes me so long to finish a book is because I don't do outlines, and I write sort of blindly, and then I discover things as I go along, but then I have to redo the book. And I sort of do so many revisions of my work because I'm always trying to kind of write out almost as a reader of my own work. And that means that I have these huge messes that I have to clean up. But for example, with this novel, without giving anything away, they're staying in this man's house and he's
Drinking up his liquor.
So that is the most disturbing thing about this novel to everyone. They do not like him for drinking this many.
What if you came home and these people have drunk up all your liquor?
I know, all this valuable liquor. And she does a few things that are shady to this man whose house she's staying in. Who's been generous enough to give him this beautiful house. And the whole novel, he's calling her and she's not picking up the phone and she's avoiding his call. And she's worried he knows what she's up to and this, that. And I didn't know the whole novel why he was actually calling her. So when it got to the end, it suddenly seemed I had left clues for myself why he was calling her, but I didn't know until I finished it. And then I had to go back and kind of find ways that would make sense. But it was already in there. And I always believe that my subconscious knows a lot more than my conscious mind when I'm writing fiction, which is why I love writing fiction. And that you sort of have to go with your obsessions and your instincts a lot. And then even a novel you can finish, you can publish, and years later, you'll see what you were actually writing about that you didn't even know you were writing about. That's what I love about it, is how mysterious it is to me. And how many surprises there are in it for me.
Hello. So I'm biracial. I was born in 1978. And so I think you talking about, being very of the time and how your identity was shaped to some degree based on that time period you were born in and that environment. And that also resonated with me. I even think about how my identity has changed over the years. I think a lot about who determines racial identity. So do we determine it for ourselves or do other people determine it, for us? And so what I'd love to know though is really broadly, what do you think that across your books you're saying about the biracial or mulatto experience to people who aren't biracial? So do you feel like there's something that is a common thread that you're saying that's a key part of the experience you would like people to better understand?
Yeah, and that's such an interesting idea you brought up about is race formed just by what other people see, or is it something else that you carry in you, or you decide? And that's been a huge question my whole life, because people don't know my racial background when I walk into a room with strangers, and yeah, I know it, and whose knowledge matters more in that moment. And I don't have, I always think my books are about a million different things. About, my first novel, there's a mother and a father and divorce and sisterhood and sister bonds and memory and grief. And I think people always say I'm writing about mixed race identity. And I'm always interested in, how other writers who are writing from a particular geography, say it's Black South or Dublin in the contemporary world of Ireland, don't get told they're writing about Irish identity. But if you're writing from the mixed experience, and we were talking about this, like it's seen as a predicament and not a people. You're not writing from a geography, you're writing from a situation. Like just being mixed is just a situation, which is not how I experience it. I experience it as the geography from which I write about all of these universal questions. So I don't go into anything I write thinking I'm going to make a point about what it is to be biracial. I'm just writing a character and a situation that intrigues me, and they are biracial. And at the same time, it informs everything about them, of course, because, when I teach writing, I somebody writes something and I don't know the character's class background or their religious beliefs or their what year they were born or where they're living. A lot of my students think they're being relatable by not having any signifiers. And I say, I need to know everything and you need to know everything. Even if it's not on the page, it's informing everything about your character. So for me, the universal is found in the specific. And the more specific your character is, the more deeply you can access these larger questions.
Hi, my name is Kelly Craig. And thank you, Diva, because it's been lovely. Also, I would say I lived in LA and I sit one time for really I was dog sitting and turned into also dog and cat. But I just yeah, well no, I just wanted to say that in this particular situation, they offered I was staying at your house for and they're like it's like family. And they're like, yeah, you're more than welcome to drink. Are they ever have guests over? And I remember that it was such a shock for me because I was like, people just be letting people in your house, like they don't drink there, like no one laid up. That was weird. Yeah. But I have a two-part question, if you don't mind. So my first question is, I recently watched The Deliverance. So if you haven't watched it, I just watched it too. Yeah, so you probably know where I'm going with the question. So for those who may or
bring it up.
Like, yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
So in the movie, there's a character named Auburn who's the white mother of a biracial daughter who's the main character. And of course, it sparked a big conversation on social media. And Lee Daniels' response to that, one was that everybody knows in Alberta, which for one I was like, gosh, no, Alberta, I'm from the South. But also, the original character that the story is based on was a African American grandmother. So obviously, he made a specific choice to switch that character out. So I guess my question is, one, what is your perspective on that situation where one, because we see this a lot in Hollywood, especially where they do switch out the Black character for a white one, but in this particular case, it was one who the daughter identifies as mixed race in this case. Just kind of what is your perspective on that aspect? Just because it's at that point, it's not even about strictly race, but race does play a role in just.
I mean, I didn't know the real story or who the real characters were, so I just watched that like lazily and the other night just because I was like, oh, let me just watch this because I'm tired. My kids drive me crazy. I'm just gonna watch horror movies, and I was actually I enjoyed a lot of the movie because I was interested in the sort of reality. I do know that character and I do know that family, and I feel like we don't see interracial families, especially who aren't wealthy. I was interested, in the class aspect of it, that we have a working class, struggling Black daughter. I mean, I felt like the daughter probably identified as Black, had 3 Black children, and had her white mother living with her, who was clearly, had a rough history and gotten into a lot of, had not parented her the way she was wanted. And I liked that portrayal because I felt like it was what I'm sort of hungering for, which is to reflect the reality of our lives, which are not segregated in these very clean ways. And that race enters that story and enters their, tensions between them. So it's not just de-raising the whole thing, but it's also not the full story of that. So I thought it was actually kind of interesting, that choice. But I didn't know there was an actual family that was based on.
Do you ever see yourself kind of switching characters in that way to kind of bring to light those conversations?
I mean, in my work, I'm not basing it on someone who's, real in a sense. I'm just writing from, actually, I shouldn't lie. I am basing it. I'm not literally basing it on them, but I'm ruthlessly using a lot of people who I've met and using details, and this is why I always get into trouble every time I publish a novel. But I'm not doing a sort of literal depiction and saying it's inspired by someone. I'm hiding the fact that it's.
No, I don't understand. My actual second question was how, throughout writing this book, how do you feel like you transformed either personally or just creatively, professionally in your writing?
I think I felt the most free writing this book. And, we have both been publishing fiction, in a white publishing world for a very long time. And I think it's changed a little bit, but in very small increments, that culture that we're.
One thing I think that has changed a lot is that when, like, you published your first book in '98, I published my book in 2002, there are hardly any Black women still in the game that were there when we were there.
Do you mean the writers?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're still there. There's not, nobody's in the game anymore. And now there are a whole bunch of Black kids writing books.
Yeah.
Like, it's enough of them where they don't have to like each other. You know, like, they can have full-on feuds, which is a luxury, right?
Yes, yes.
It's a luxury to have enough people to hate some of them.
That's really true.
And that's where they are now.
No.
So I think that's a huge,
No, you're
huge
right.
change.
No, and that's really interesting about what you're saying about over time, they are in the game. A lot of the people we began, right?
And we did not begin with very many.
No, there was just this.
There was hardly anybody. The literary establishment would pick two, a boy and a girl. And that was that. Yeah. And so now, I mean, like I said, these kids, I used to call all of these new writers on the phone. They were so rare. I would call them and give them helpful hints. But now, there's too many of them.
Well, this is, it's a good question though, because, and one of the things I'm sort of touching on even in this book is that when I published my first novel, and this goes back to the other question, I was told after it was a bestseller, it did well, but I was told, okay, now you should move on from the mixed race experience and write more universal themes. And that was literally the comment I got from white publishers was like, and what I felt was underneath it was, you get to graduate to being a white girl now. And, that was a situation you were exploring, but like, let's move on. And when I didn't do that, there was these middle years when that was the comment I get. Why do you keep writing about the mixed race thing? And I was like, these are people with like lives. They are mixed, but that's not the subject. It's the geography. And I think this is my 6th book, and I'm like, get it now? I'm not going to stop writing characters who are of this world, and they're going to have all sorts of things happening in their lives. And like, so I do actually feel that I'm trying to kind of write a world into existence that has been completely erased from the landscape. And, that goes back to the deliverance thing. Like, that is a world that exists, and why don't we see it? Why do we only see biracial people, visually, but we don't actually get the stories of the family dynamics that came into making these people and, making these worlds. So I think I felt like I'm just going to keep doing this, and at some point they're going to get it, maybe. Yeah, I'm glad you did. Thank you.
Well, I think we have to wrap. DR was getting ready to kick us out of here. You saw him? Did you see him? He was about to kick us out of here, but I'm going to gracefully put my hands down and say, I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank you for this really wonderful book. I want to just endorse it and say that it is a pleasure to read. Like, you will turn the pages, force you to turn the next page. You will enjoy it. You will pass it on to your friends, and make sure you check her out on Good Morning America for the Good Morning America Book Club, because she is this month. Is it every month?
Yes. September choice.
Yeah, she's the September choice, and it is so well.
Thanks for your great question.